We're a number of episodes into Is It Fascist, and we're a little bit more comfortable, and we've refined the criteria I've come up with. I thought, why don't we go back and redo the first episode? Let's take another look at Maga, Trumpism, whatever you want to call it, and ask once again the question, is it fascist? Because I still see this on almost a daily basis, that Maga is the new Nazi party, that Trump is Hitler reborn, that Maga is this like one-to-one perfect comparison to 1920s to 1930s fascism, just in an American context. And I just find the insistence that Trumpism or like that MAGA is a form of fascism, in my opinion at least, shows a lot of historical ignorance and the tendency of these people to not take it as a serious political family of political ideologies that grew out of a specific context and time, but to just use it as pejorative for anything you don't like. And Republicans are equally guilty of this, as they refer to basically anything Democrats do as fascist too. I'm, however, with this series and this criteria list, trying to come up with something a bit more objective to say what were the actual traits of 20th century fascism. What do I think makes it ideologically distinct from, say, authoritarian conservatism or communism or something? And taken together, hopefully, if we go through all of these and say whether a movement has them or not, we can give an accurate comparison to fascism, and we can determine how close is the actual movement to it. Because sometimes people tend to get very much wrapped up in the details and they can't see the forest for the trees. They see like Trump's personal charisma, some of his rhetoric, some of his followers, and they go, well, that on a very superficial level resembles something from the 1930s, so therefore it's fascist. No political movement in human history as a conservative has had a charismatic leader prior to Donald Trump, except for Hitler and Mussolini, and there's been no other charismatic leader. That being said, let us get into the first criteria. Now, this is what I think is the foundational concept of fascism, which is an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary, conservative, and revolutionary progressive ideas. That is, you are taking conservative ideas. So, what would a conservative idea be? Social structure, gender roles, traditional family, religion, nationalism, uh, an honoring of the past, a return to traditional values, all the kind of stuff that conservatives normally talk about. And then with revolutionary slash progressive ideas, this will be taking modern ideas. So this can range anywhere from female suffrage, because a lot of fascist governments brought that in, to embracing very radical and often kind of weird scientific racial theories, to just a general embracing of the idea of the progress of history. Like, we need technology, we need to build a utopia on Earth, a love of science, maybe settling other planets, just weird invented like the social credit system, for instance. I don't know if I call it fascist or not, but that is like a progressive or revolutionary idea that I don't even know if there's really something that's ever been tried that's its equivalent, at least on that scale. But that's taking new technology and saying we're going to try to build something completely different. And if you were like to try to use something like that for conservative or Catholic or something means, I would say that would be an example of something that's syncretic. So that being said, is MAGA ideologically syncretic? Well, let's look at like it's not 100% coherent movement, but what are some of the major things that are posited by MAGA? Moderate protectionism, American nationalism, isolationism or pragmatism in international affairs, opposition to immigration, a desire for strict adherence to the Constitution and skepticism of the power of government, uh, wanting gun rights, wanting parents to have more control over their children's lives, their children's education, and a lot, and it's disproportionately evangelical and conservative Catholic. So, are any of the things I just mentioned particularly modern, progressive, or revolutionary in the American? Is the idea of having a conservative populist movement that's anti-immigration, that supports and what I mean, it's even called the American school economics. American school economics is literally a free market economy with moderate tariffs and government investment in infrastructure and education. It's the policy that America pursued for like the first 100 years or so of its existence and was extremely successful. Trump is not particularly good at explaining what his economic views are, but if you really kind of go through it, it's like, okay, moderate protectionism. Um, yes, we tend to be fairly in favor of building infrastructure, but there's also a lot of just normal conservative things like lower taxes, balanced budgets, smaller amounts of government spending. They're just not quite as like fanatically anti-government in terms of their rhetoric as some of the conservatives from the 90s were or the Reagan era. But is any of Trump's economic ideas really that innovative or different? No, like they aren't. Is having a movement that is dominated by evangelical Christians that weird? No, that's something you see back from like the very beginning of America. You've had evangelical movements in like both the Democratic and the Republican Party all the time. The idea of America being a Christian country is like one of the oldest debates within it. That's right back from the beginning. I'm not talking about the Constitution, but the idea as to whether or not America needed to be explicitly Christian is something that's always been debated. So my point is that nothing about MAGA is revolutionary. It's maybe mixing together different traditional ideas in a way you haven't seen for a while. I think it's also important to keep in mind that if anything, the last like 40, 50 years have been something of a uh, have maybe more been the difference than the norm. Like the general commitment to unlimited free trade, for instance, the lack of any real opposition to immigration, all these kind of things are almost they more stand out as a form of revolution, and you can almost view Trumpism as bringing back a lot of what would be normal in American politics prior to the New Deal or prior to even just the 1960s. So in this account, I have to say Maga gets a 0. Number 2, Identitarianism with a clearly defined in group, out and out group. This could be cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. So a defining aspect of fascism, and I think most right wing ideologies, is there's some emphasis on contrast and us versus them mentality. Specifically, one that comes down to, like I said, cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial characteristics. Whereas in a left wing sense, it would come down to uh, social class, like socioeconomic class, income, profession type, something like that. That tends to be much less important in more right wing or conservative contexts compared to these other kind of identitarian issues. Now, where does MAGA fit into this? MAGA, I think, is not necessarily explicit in all respects, but MAGA does represent to a large extent, a traditional American reaction to the social revolution of the 20th century. And I mean that in all senses. It is a religious reaction to secularism, atheism, anti Christianity, the breaking down of traditional social values, the breaking down of traditional social systems, um, the changing of America from being a Christian country that had a variety of different Christian faiths within it to being a Christian but also secular country with all these other religions thrown in. There's dissatisfaction from that, from forcing multiculturalism on America. And there is definitely an ethno-religious, racial component to it. There is an aspect of it, given the support from how predominantly white it is, and people who want to go back to when America was overwhelmingly white, when it was a white Christian country. It's not necessarily that they want like a pure 100% society, but they don't like it that the country has gone from being like 90% white to like 60% white or whatever in the span of a couple of decades. That all the civil rights legislation has been passed, which disenfranchises them and gives more rights to minorities than they themselves enjoy. So I would say there is an identitarian concept to it. I mean, the whole thing is about America first, make America great again. And this can refer to, in kind of, I guess, a more civic view, America versus other countries. But I do think there is this identitarianism of, and even if not, even if all the members of it are not white or Christian, that is kind of the implicit identity that underlies a lot of it, is at least a return to those values and a view of that as being the ideal rather than what we have at the moment. Number three, a revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or revenge itself against a historical foe. This is something you saw a lot, like with Nazi Germany. It was, we need to get revenge against France. We need to get revenge against the British. Germany needs to be restored to the height it was under the Kaisers, under the Holy Roman Empire. We need to attain what we previously lost. A lot of this romantic nationalism, it often resembles, it includes an over idealization of the past, saying like, oh, things used to be amazing, things used to be great. But it's taking a lot of historical symbols, a lot of things that happened in history, and making that kind of the basis of your movement. Now, this can always either be kind of a positive or negative nationalist thing. This can be, once again, like romantic nationalists, like we want to restore the America of Jefferson, like the America where of small holders, where like most of the population was middle class and owned their own businesses and owned their own these houses and owned their own farms, and we want to go back to that kind of ideal. Or we want to return society to being like a Christian society where people went to church on Sundays and stuff like that. Or it can also be something more negative, like we want to get revenge on various groups of people who've wronged America in the past 50 years, or groups within society who have undermined America. Generally speaking, though, when it goes to MAGA, I think it's far more in the revanchist, sorry, not revanchist, the romantic nationalist category, is the people who support Trump and people who are Trumpists have a deep nostalgia and desire to see what they view as the corruptions of and the weaknesses of the modern American society burned away and it kind of restored to being something more like what it used to be. They often will, if you look at the sort of things they talk about, it'll often be the Rust Belt, the hollowing out of American industry, the collapse of the American family, out of control crime, lower social mobility. It is very much a romantic nationalist movement. I don't think it is particularly revanchist, though. I don't think it's particularly focused on hatred of other peoples so much as it wants a recentering of American priorities to stuff that benefits the American people and American society. We have a belief in the supremacy of the party or state. Now, how anyone could think that this applies to MAGA, I don't know. Um, if you let's look at like what are the main talking points of like MAGA? Drain the swamp. We have drain the swamp. We have get government out of stuff. We have lower taxes. We have the Democrats are communists. We have state rights, parental rights, adhere to the Constitution, let us keep our guns. Like, if you go through just about anything that, like, MAGA conservatives attest to, none of it involves the supremacy of the party or state. They're not as necessarily anti government as perhaps some of the conservatives we had during the 1990s were, in that they do tend to be more supportive of stuff like um, maybe infrastructure projects or tariffs or something like that. But if we're going to say that, like, wanting moderate tariffs on foreign goods makes you into like a totalitarian statist, that's just absurd. By and large, most American conservatives just want to be left alone. They want to go to work, they want to go to church, they want to raise their kids, make some money. There's some rules there for government, but that's generally what they want. They're not malcontents. They're not like people who want to use politics as a way to create the new man. They just want to be left alone, by and large. The ultimate idea isn't to build a totalitarian state. If Republicans use state power, what is it often to do? Is to do stuff like, oh, I don't want my kids being taught garbage. I don't want tech companies censoring me. I don't want my like basic services to be denied to me because I said an opinion somebody else didn't like. Uh, Stuff like that. Like the things that you could argue that are authoritarian that they do are often, at least in their perspective, in the pursuit of freedom, in the pursuit of restraining some aspects of government or some aspects of private society that impinge upon freedom. So while there is definitely a strong loyalty to America as a country and to uh, the state they're from, like what is drain a swamp if not the idea that the American state is fundamentally like this rotting, disgusting, putrid mess that needs to be aerated, that needs to be shrunk. Like you see people who, like MAGA people, who are like, we need to just fire everybody in the federal government and start over. We just need to nuke the FBI. All of these groups are so incompetent, so corrupt. They just they aren't even really worth saving. And if we want to talk about party, there's no MAGA party. And a lot of these people hate the Republicans. They aren't uncritically loyal to it. Have you seen how often the Republicans get into these internal disasters? Like, all they really have to go off on this is some MAGA aligned Republicans have finally realized that they have power and that they're able to use government power to accomplish their goals. Um, like, like what Ron DeSantis did in Florida, and that Trump is a charismatic leader, and that's basically it. But there's a zero here. A conception of an idealized new man. I'm going to have to say 100% no. So this is something you see in both communism and fascism. Is the idea that there's going to be a new man, that through science, through national reawakening, we're going to have the new man. He's going to be distinct from the historical one. He's going to be brave. He's going to be compassionate. He's going to be generous. He's going to be willing to sacrifice and not think of his own needs in a way that human beings just weren't previously. I mean, does that sound like MAGA at all? Does MAGA are MAGA the people who are like, we have to pump everyone full of soy and hormones and make men act like women and women act like men, and I don't know, make this like it's not. It's, if anything, it's a very just kind of normal commitment to basic American Christian conservative ideas of masculinity and femininity. It's not even really extreme with regards to that. You don't see MAGA, like, for instance, saying we need to get rid of the women's suffrage or stuff like that. They just don't like a lot of the aspects of the social revolution. They don't like the trans stuff. They don't like the attempts to completely destroy the traditional family and traditional gender roles. But I've never really seen like we need to create the new American male who's like going to be this like hero of Trump that's going to go out there, and it's absurd. They just want like people to go to work, to go to church, and have kids. Is basically at the end of the day what American conservatives want. So there's a zero here. A foreign policy that places national self interest above ideology, international law, or traditional morality. So this is a somewhat difficult one, and this is one I've really been struggling with. As you might have seen if you've seen previous episodes, I've reworded this. Basically, this is here to try to differentiate fascism from something like neoconservatism or communism, wherein the international relations policy of those is entirely based on ideology, supporting other communists. It's doing whatever the international community says you need to do, even if it's not convenient for you. Whereas a fascist one is more like you just do whatever it takes to obtain an advantage in your national interest. And if that means you shake hands with people who you don't like, that you ideologically disagree with, that you're willing to basically do business with everybody, and if you have to backstab sometimes people who are more ideologically similar to you to get what you need, then that's okay. It's a very difficult area to describe, but I would give Maga a point here because they don't want like the spreading democracy wars. They don't want to just go to war with China or Russia or um, Syria for the sake of some abstract concept. They find the whole concept of international law in the UN to be pretty G slur. Um, there will be some people in that kind of category. I don't know if you can call me Mog. I don't know if you call me Mog or not, but my foreign policy is partially based on this, but also partially based on I want to use military and economic force to try to help Christian minorities who are being oppressed. So I don't know if that counts as being ideological or not. But I would say there's a very big break between Bush era foreign policy and MAGA foreign policy. 7, indifference to or marginalization of economics. Now, this is something you saw, like, can anyone tell me what the National Socialist economic policy was? I mean, nobody knows. It depended a lot on the particular period. Sometimes it was like central planning, sometimes it was state capitalist, sometimes it was more free market. Generally speaking, it tends to be very autarkic, in which there's banning of like foreign trade, but this seems to be done very much for like an ideological route. If you get into particularly like Japan, there's this belief in the national spiritual awakening will be able to make up for any kind of shortcomings in terms of tank production or technology or natural resources. This tends to be, I think, a very fundamental aspect of fascism, that the human spirit, that collective effort, that shared sacrifice can overcome any kind of material deficiency. And so it's kind of seek like a pure society, a moral society, a good society, and then economics will just kind of follow from that. And you'll often have cases where they try to come up with just weird economic systems um, that try to fit their ideology, and it's just very odd in a lot of cases. And this kind of comes back to the whole mixture of reactionary and progressive ideas. This is also to differentiate it from communism, which is entirely focused on economics. So is MAGA indifferent to economics? No, not at all. I mean, MAGA largely came out of the Tea Party, right? I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to do. What was the Tea Party's thing? Well, the backronym is tax enough already. It was we want smaller government, we want lower taxes, we want a balanced budget, we want to deal with the national debt, we want certain things privatized, and stuff like that. At its core, and once again, people portray MAGA as being like this left wing economic thing because it's not as like rabidly anti-state as some of the stuff you had during the 1990s. Um, but ultimately, like they have pretty normal conservative like economic views. Like, okay, we want a free market economy with some protectionism, but we want taxes lower, we want government spending lower. There's a large emphasis on stuff like inflation, like the cost of stuff at the pump, the cost of groceries. Um, if anything, a lot of the opposition within kind of MAGA to stuff like the Russo-Ukraine war is because it's increasing energy prices and because it's causing inflation. The economy, the national debt, the budget is extremely important. It's not. It's they don't really take a mind over matter approach to this. A spiritual mobilization will free us from the limits of the market. They're not as monomaniacally focused on economics as maybe some libertarians were in the 90s or even during the Bush era. But once again, a lot of those people, when they got into power, governed just like big spending drunk liberals. When they actually were in the position to cut taxes and cut spending, they didn't cut spending; they just massively increased debt. So, number 8, a masculine approach to problem solving, focusing on decisive action. Now, this is one of those is it what you say or what you do types of things. Because this is a core aspect of Maga. And this is where we kind of get into Trump himself, is he portrays himself as a man of action. That he's like, he's not a politician, he's an outsider, he's a CEO, he's an alpha male, he's a Chad. He's going to go in and do what needs to be done. If somebody screws with America, he's going to blow them up. If the swamp is oppressing Americans, he's going to go in and take them out. That he is this man of action, and that, like, a real American man just acts like he defends his family, he earns money for his family. He doesn't wait to rely on the government to do everything for him. In practice, though, Trump's administration was one of the most impotent, like him being completely incapable of getting anything done. No one listened to him. It was just kind of a complete shit show. Um, Also, they're just as part of this is that's missing is I would almost argue something like this would maybe apply more to Black Lives Matter because they're willing to use like terrorism and violence and intimidation in order to achieve their that they're just willing to act with or without government support. And while Trumpism does appeal a lot to that more kind of traditional American conception of masculinity, in practice it really just doesn't achieve that at all. So it's a difficult one. If we're talking about Trump personally, this would apply to the movement as a whole. I'm going to have to give this half a point because it's very very difficult to separate this from Trump. I think there is a general emphasis on decisive action, but it's also very like anti-authoritarian and skeptical of state power. So that's something I think that does different. Encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. So this one is also very different. Because on one, because this can refer to a couple of different. So to me, kind of the archetypical aspects of political action is, you know, stuff like the marches in the streets, the red guards, the stuff that a lot of totalitarian societies have. Try to make the average person feel directly involved in their government, that they're like you've seen the Starship Troopers. I'm doing my part. Are you doing your part? That kind of thing, or stuff like the Four Pests campaign, where the Chinese exterminated the sparrows as a way of getting everybody involved in the national. So, while on one level, MAGA is very much a mass movement, it's Trump giving speeches and stuff like that. On the other, it's very like anti-political. It's very much like none of the people, most of the people there don't want to be involved in politics, and this is one of the reasons why American conservatives lose so often. Because, as I said earlier, they're more involved in their church, their job, their family, like them, the in and outs of how the political system operate and doing advocacy and all this other kind of stuff is just something they don't really have any kind of commitment to. However, Trumpism is significantly more populist than normal Republican politics. And it does have more of a protest, it does have more of a grassroots feel. That's not exactly, though, like what I mean, though. Like when Trump was in power, I don't think we had like the kind. Like, actually, once again, Black Lives Matter is a very good example of this because they demand direct participation of everyone. Like if you have an event at your company, you have to go to it. You can't just sit at it. You have to actively participate in it. You have to give speeches. You have to make declarations. You have to take part in the ongoing political campaigns. Whereas that's just not really a thing within within Trumpism. If you were going to have a MAGA society, I really don't think, other than like Fourth of July parades and some stuff like that, you would really have that much in terms of government sponsored mass action. So I'm going to give it half a point here, but this one is debatable. Um, Number 10, Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite inner group to safeguard the new order and revolution. 100% no. I mean, isn't that the entire point of QAnon is conspiracy theories based around Vanguard? is the idea that there is this unknown vanguard that's controlling everything that they want to get rid of, and they want to return control of society directly to the people, or just to have a less powerful government. There's no vanguardist aspects of Maga. In other words, it's very anti. The only thing that really it has superficially in common with it is, once again, that Trump is this charismatic figure that wields a lot of power over his movement. This isn't due to like secret police though, or like the inner circle or stuff like that. If anything, like if you look at the people Trump surrounds himself with, it's an ongoing dumpster fire. Like people snake on him so often, they get kicked out, they get brought back. It's a fucking disaster. So is Trumpism vanguardist? No, no, not in any feasible way. Also the fact that the GOP establishment hated Trump and tried to undermine him, and still are. Okay, now here's a tricky one. An often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. So, if we are talking about Trump in terms of his influence on his supporters and within what we consider to be MAGA, yes. If we're talking about Trump when he actually has anything resembling political power, no. When Trump was in office, he was one of the weakest presidents in American history. We had like him basically having to go hide because the army refused to follow his orders during the Washington D.C. riots. Basically, everybody in the country just ignored him. He had virtually no control over the American government. He has, I guess, like his control over his movement, though, is once again, there's not really an infrastructure there. It's not as if he has like the secret Trump police or stuff like that, or like a really well organized organization. Even the Republican Party generally doesn't do what he tells them. All he really has is his personal charisma and the personal affection of his followers. A lot of the things within this context they just don't have. Like Trump, once again, Trump was extremely weak as a president. He wasn't able to get much done. He wasn't able to get people to do what he told them to do. I mean, the fact that Trump failed to inject ethics in video game journalism so spectacularly, I think shows that this is not the case. However, he is a charismatic leader whose movement is largely a personalist one. So we're going to give them half a point here. Finally, sublimation of the individual and individual rights into the interests of the group, state, or party. Now, this is 100% no. The whole thing about MAGA is they want their gun rights, they want their freedom of speech, they want their kids. It's all about individual rights. It's all about private property rights. It's all about owning your own guns. It's all about you make your own decisions for your kids, your health care. It's very much that. The fact that it has some collectivist aspirations to it doesn't just because a movement has a concept of the greater good and says sometimes you have to sacrifice the individual for the greater good doesn't make it like this. It just makes it like realistic and practical. It's not like the Soviet Union or something where it's like we have to just exterminate entire classes of society and re-educate them in order to build the perfect world. You just don't see stuff like Maga. So it's going to get a 0 there. So that being said, let us add this up. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4.5. Now I'm going to give it another half a point because there's a couple there that I gave points to that. You know what? Let's be generous. We'll give it a full point here, and we will give it a full point for encouragement of mass action. We'll add in full points in those two categories, which will bring us to 6. So MAGA gets 6 out of 12 on the fascist scale, making it neither fascist nor para-fascist. Para-fascist maybe being something like a conservative authoritarian government, or something more Naz-bullish, maybe like Stalinism would be in Ceausescu's Romania. But I think pretty clearly we've shown that it's not a fascist ideology. Not at all. Well, there's some things that might be in common, like nationalism, socially conservative ideas. There, a lot of it just isn't. Like, if we were to take Trump out of it and to just have it as like a basic, if we were to say that, like, just take MAGA as a purely ideological phenomenon and not have Trump, you would have to take additional aspects of it. Like, you would have to take out like the man of action thing, probably. You'd have to take out the charismatic leader. It would actually get a lower score if it was the exact same ideology without Trump in it. So once again, I don't see how Trumpism is a form of fascism. It's not. It's conservative populism that is just very American in all of its forms. It's very much a return to kind of traditional American conservatism, the kind of stuff you might have seen out of the Democratic Party before the New Deal, or you might have seen out of the Republican Party before the 1990s. I just don't think it's particularly like weird or innovative or syncretic. But that's my opinion. I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless, and more content to come.